Rejected by Alpha, a wolf romance fantasy audiobook. An unforgettable story filled with romance, passion, heartbreak, and a few surprises along the way. I sit on the edge of the bed, my heart thudding against my ribs. The room is cast in a soft amber glow, shadows flickering across the walls, and the quiet hum of the night surrounds me. My fingers brush over the delicate lace of my bridal gown, feeling the silk skim across my skin. Tonight, I'm his, and yet my mind spins with so many unknowns. Just then, the door creaks open, and I glance up, my breath catching as Liam steps into the room. He's every bit the fierce, confident alpha, the man who holds my future, my vows in his hands. His eyes, dark and burning, fall on me, taking in the gown, the flushed cheeks, and perhaps the hint of nervous anticipation I can't hide. He crosses the room in a few strides, and I barely have a moment to steady myself before he's in front of me.
"I will be gentle, but try not to scream,"
he said, his voice a low murmur, a hint of amusement dancing in his gaze. "Yeah," I whisper, biting my lip, feeling the warmth of his eyes wash over me. He brushes a stray strand of hair from my face, his fingers lingering on my cheek.
"Good,"
he murmurs, and then he dips his head, capturing my lips fiercely. His hands find my waist, pulling me close, and the tension in my body melts under his touch, giving way to something else entirely. His lips trailed down my neck, his breath warm against my skin, and a soft sigh escaped me as his hands settled on my waist, holding me close. The gentle pressure of his hand sent a shiver through me, and I found myself leaning into him, drawn by the warmth and safety of his embrace. His fingers slipped to the delicate straps on my shoulders, easing them down, his gaze never leaving mine as he undressed me with a reverence that made my heart race.
"You're beautiful, Alice.
He whispered, his voice husky with emotion.
Being here with you like this, it feels like everything I've ever wanted."
I shivered under his touch, feeling his warmth against my skin as his fingers trailed down my stomach. Slowly, he knelt down, his hands trailing along my sides as he took in every curve with a reverent touch, each movement sending warmth through me, making me feel cherished and adored. His hands found mine, guiding me until we knelt together, our eyes meeting in a moment of shared trust, of vulnerability that felt both grounding and freeing. With slow, unhurried motions, I reached for his shirt, my fingers grazing his skin as I unbuttoned it, pushing it from his shoulders to reveal the strong lines beneath. My hands explored his chest, tracing the warmth and strength there, and he breathed in sharply, his own hands resting lightly against my face, lifting my chin so our eyes met once more.
"Let me have all of you tonight."
He murmurs, his voice rough and deep, filled with an intensity that makes my heart race. Lifting me effortlessly, he lays me back on the bed, his body pressing into mine as he leans over me. I feel his weight, his warmth, his strength surrounding me, and I can barely think, the intensity of his gaze making me feel both seen and claimed. I let myself sink into the moment, into him, until nothing else exists. I woke up to the soft light filtering through the heavy curtains, the remnants of last night's passion swirling in my mind like a warm breeze. The bed felt too large, the sheets too empty, and I wrapped the blanket tighter around me, feeling its softness against my skin. A small smile tugged at my lips as I recalled Liam's touches, his whispered words laced with promises of love and forever. But as the warmth of those memories washed over me, a nagging unease settled in my stomach. Where was he? Surely he must be around here somewhere, lingering just outside my reach. I pushed the blanket aside and swung my legs over the side of the bed, the coolness of the wooden floor sending a slight shiver through me. I quickly adjusted my dress, smoothing down the fabric which still held traces of our last moments together. Just as I was lost in my thoughts, a sharp knock echoed through the room, jolting me from my reverie. "Who is it?" I called, my voice still husky from sleep.
"Let us in,"
came a reply, a sharpness in the voice that made me hesitate. I opened the door slowly, revealing 2 women standing before me, both of them members of the pack, their expressions tight with worry.
Alice, we need to know where Liam is.
One of them urged, her sea-green eyes searching my face for answers I didn't have. I thought he'd be here, I stammered, confusion swirling within me. I haven't seen him since last night. The women exchanged glances, their concern palpable. I stepped back and invited them inside, the door closing behind us as the air thickened with tension. "I'll help you look," I said, feeling an urge to act rather than dwell in uncertainty. "Let's check the fortress." We searched the grand halls, the familiar sense of the pack blending with the wood and stone of our home. Yet the place felt different. It felt empty. Panic started to bubble beneath my calm facade. "Liam!" I called out, my voice echoing through the corridors. Each empty room was a reminder of the void he left behind. We climbed stairs and explored chambers, calling his name over and over until I was left hoarse. Finally, I made my way to the heart of the fortress, where Liam's mother resided. She sat quietly, her eyes filled with a mix of worry and resolve. "Have you seen Liam?" I asked, my heart pounding. She looked up at me, her expression softening.
"Alice, my dear, I haven't seen him since the night of your wedding, but you mustn't worry. He's strong, and he knows how to take care of himself."
But her words felt like a thin veil over the chaos that was spreading throughout the pack. I could hear voices rising outside, murmurs of concern, of panic. "I can feel it," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. "Something is wrong. What if he—"
"Don't say that.
She interrupted gently, reaching out to take my hand in hers.
He will return. I have faith in him, and you must too. You are strong, Alice, and you need to lead our pack in his absence. This is your time."
Her encouragement was like a balm to my fraying nerves, but the fear clawed at my insides. I nodded, forcing a smile even as the knot of anxiety twisted tighter. As I stepped back into the chaos of the pack, I realized that I couldn't sit and wait any longer. I needed to take charge. I needed to find Liam, not just for myself, but for the pack that looked to us for strength. "Gather, everyone," I instructed the women who had followed me. "We're going to search for him together." The determination that flowed through me was both exhilarating and terrifying. What if I failed? What if Liam needed me and I wasn't there? But I would not let fear dictate my actions. As I rallied our pack, a flicker of hope ignited within me. I would find him. I had to. And as the sun rose higher, casting light on our determined faces, I felt a pull, a whisper of something in the air that hinted at the magic and mystery surrounding us. It was a promise, a signal that I was not alone in this. Liam would return, and I would be ready to face whatever came next. I've never felt the weight of loneliness quite like this. Days blurred together as I stepped into Liam's shoes, leading our pack with a strength I never knew I had. My every breath, every decision, felt anchored by the absence of him, like I was guiding them while missing half of myself. Today, though, the sorrow felt heavier, pressing down on me until I could barely keep my composure. Leaving the pack's worries behind, I made my way to the secluded pond nestled just outside the village. I slipped out of my clothes, draping them over the low branch of an old tree, and sank into the water's cool embrace. Closing my eyes, I let myself drift, memories of Liam stirring in my mind. The way he looked at me, his hands warm on my skin, that night that felt like a promise whispered in the dark. The water felt calming, my hand trailing over my skin, as if I could trace the memory of him. But just as I let myself get lost, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, a presence. I opened my eyes, scanning the tree line, and then I saw him. A figure stood partially hidden behind a palm tree, watching. He was tall, with broad shoulders that tapered down in a way that spoke of strength, even from a distance. Dark hair fell over his forehead, barely concealing eyes that were fixed on me. He wore a black leather jacket and jeans that clung to his frame, rugged but somehow dignified. Around his neck hung a chain with a pendant that gleamed faintly in the sunlight, and his gaze, intense, unwavering, as if he hadn't seen a woman before, or maybe as if he'd just seen someone he thought he'd lost. A slow smile tugged at my lips as I called out, "I see you! No point hiding now!" He froze, barely reacting, as if still trying to decide if I was real or just a mirage. I couldn't help but laugh a little. "Come on, gather your courage, I've already seen you." He emerged slowly, his steps hesitant, his hands tucked in the pockets of his jeans. There was a nervous energy about him, though he tried to mask it. When he came closer, his gaze held a strange familiarity, like he was remembering something or someone. A shyness filled me at the thought of him seeing me like this, vulnerable and open. I need to slip into my clothes. "Turn around," I instructed, voice a little firmer, wanting a moment to gather myself. To my surprise, he didn't argue. His shoulders turned, though I caught a glimpse of him tensing as I slipped back into my dress. "All right," I called. "You can look now." He turned to face me, and for a moment, we just stood there, sizing each other up. Up close, he was even more striking, his eyes dark and mysterious but softened by a kind of vulnerability I recognized. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice steady despite the unspoken tension between us.
Adrian,
He replied, his voice deep, almost soothing.
I was just passing through on my way to the city.
"Passing through?" I repeated, still not quite buying it. There was a pull in his eyes, a curiosity mixed with something deeper. It made me want to trust him and keep my guard up all at once.
And you are?
I hesitated for a heartbeat, unsure of how much to reveal, but something in his gaze felt honest, almost disarming. "I am Alice," I said, watching his expression for a flicker of recognition, some clue that he might have heard my name before. I lead this pack now, though I wasn't meant to." He nodded, his eyes drifting briefly to the pond, as if he were giving me space to continue. My husband, Liam, disappeared," I went on, the words somehow coming out more easily than I'd expected. "I know he's out there, somewhere. I can feel it, like a part of him is still with me. I'll find him, even if it means crossing into every corner of this world." Adrian's gaze sharpened, his brows drawing together in thought. I wondered if he understood what it was to lose someone, if he knew that hollow ache that didn't let you rest.
So you're out here searching for him?
He said slowly, his voice laced with a kind of respect I hadn't expected. "Every day," I replied, feeling a quiet determination settle within me. "And I will find him, no matter what." Adrian's eyes softened, and he looked at me with a quiet admiration that I didn't fully understand. For a long moment, he was silent. Then he let out a soft chuckle, though it didn't quite reach his eyes.
It's rare to see such loyalty,
He said, almost to himself.
Most people would have moved on.
"I can't move on from something that's still there," I whispered, almost more to myself than to him. There was a pang in my chest, a reminder of Liam's laugh, his smile, the way he'd made everything feel like it would be all right. Adrian nodded, looking away for a second, then back at me, his gaze softer, as if he were seeing something vulnerable in me.
I get that.
He murmured, his voice almost lost in the breeze. The fortress was quiet, bathed in the soft amber of the evening sun that poured through the tall windows. My eyes wandered across the landscape as I sipped the last of my coffee, the warmth of the cup grounding me amid all the uncertainty. Then, something unusual caught my attention. There, near the gates, was Adrian. He was scanning the area, moving with a kind of deliberate caution. The way he glanced around, squinting at corners as though expecting to find something, made me smirk. "Are you looking for something?" I called out, my voice breaking through the quiet. He turned, startled, his hand reflexively going to his pockets. It was something I'd noticed he did whenever he was nervous, a small tell that gave him away more than he realized. He hesitated, clearly taken aback, but his eyes never left mine.
Yeah, I was just passing by.
He said, his voice low, uncertain.
Thought it might be your fortress.
His words were halting, almost careful, as though choosing each one. Even then, he was focused on me, as if the very sight of me was the answer to whatever had brought him here. You shouldn't be here, I replied, unable to keep the warning from my tone. There are more wolves around these parts than you know. It's dangerous. I gestured toward the woods, hoping to shield him from any prying eyes that might notice a human lingering near our home. He gave me a look that was hard to read, part stubbornness, part something I couldn't quite place, and I led him into the cover of the trees, letting the fortress fade behind us. As we walked deeper into the woods, Adrian broke the silence.
I want to help you find Liam.
He said suddenly, and his words hung in the air, catching me off guard. I stopped, turning to face him fully. Help. Me? I repeated, the words sounding foreign even as I said them. It was one thing to talk about finding Liam, but it was another to hear someone else offer to help, to bring the impossible quest into the world outside my own heart. He nodded, that familiar intensity in his gaze as he studied me, as if he was both nervous and incredibly certain all at once.
You can't keep leaving your pack, so stay and lead them. And at night,
He continued, his voice low, almost a whisper.
I'll help you search. We'll start with the nearby cities. Who knows? Maybe he's out there, trapped somewhere.
I held his gaze, caught between shock and something that felt uncomfortably like gratitude. I'd gotten so used to the idea that this search was mine alone, but here Adrian was, offering to share it with me, to take on the endless nights and empty roads for a man he'd never even met. I could feel my resolve softening, though I tried to mask it. Tonight, then, I murmured, letting myself lean into the hope of it. Meet me in the woods. We'll head out after nightfall. A slow smile spread across Adrian's face, one that seemed to carry a hint of relief. The moon was a silver crescent as I slipped from the fortress, moving quietly through the hallways and out into the woods. I'd found Adrian waiting in the same spot, hidden in the shadows. His hands tucked nervously into his pockets, giving me a small, lopsided grin when he saw me.
You ready?
He asked, a flicker of excitement mixed with worry in his eyes. I nodded. We rode through the night, the hum of his bike filling the silence as we searched the city's winding streets, alleys, and quiet corners, all in hopes of finding Liam. As he slowed to a stop at the red light, I shifted forward, suddenly pressed against Adrian. The unexpected closeness sent a rush through me. I could feel his muscles tense beneath my touch, a familiarity as if he'd done this with me countless times before. We'd become something like friends during these nightly searches, comfortable in each other's silence but sharing the same focus. Still, even with Adrian's closeness, a part of me stayed guarded, unwilling to let anyone truly in while my heart was still bound to Liam. Adrian seemed to sense that, and he never pushed, letting our friendship settle into the spaces between words, in stolen glances and the quiet hours just before dawn. As the first hint of morning crept over the horizon, Adrian turned to me with an almost reluctant expression.
You should go back. Get some rest.
He said, though I could tell he didn't want to let me go just yet. The days followed the same pattern, tending to the pack by day, searching the city by night with Adrian. Our late-night hunts felt like borrowed time, a reprieve from my duties, though we always returned empty-handed. Liam's absence felt like a hollow ache. It was a quiet afternoon. I took the chance to clean up a bit. I'd been tidying up in Liam's study, dusting off the shelves and rearranging his books, when a thick, worn document slipped out from a small drawer in his cabin. I almost ignored it, but something, a gut feeling, made me stop. As I unfolded the paper, my heart skipped a beat. It was Liam's handwriting, scrawled across the page in a way that seemed urgent, almost desperate. I read the line slowly, letting the words sink in.
I don't know what's happening to me. I crave for blood now.
My breath hitched. Crave for blood? My head spun, questions colliding with each other faster than I could catch up. The Liam I knew, my Liam, wasn't supposed to have secrets like this. And if he did, why hadn't he told me? My hands trembled as I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. Without thinking, I turned and stormed out of the room, my steps fueled by a mix of shock and fury. I knew where I was going, and I knew exactly who I needed answers from. Downstairs in the dim, quiet parlor, I found her, Liam's mother, regal as ever, sipping tea with a calmness that only fueled my anger. Without waiting, I placed the document in front of her, my gaze locked on her face. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice a strange blend of hurt and accusation. Her face shifted, an unmistakable flicker of fear crossing her features before she masked it with a stern, unreadable expression. But it was there. She knew exactly what I was talking about, and she had no intention of hiding it.
Alice, where did you find this?
Her tone was controlled, almost too calm. "Does that matter?" I shot back, my voice hardening. "What matters is that I did find it, and I need you to explain, now." Her gaze dropped to the paper, her fingers tracing the edge as if buying herself a moment to gather her thoughts. For a long time she didn't answer, and just when I thought she wouldn't say anything, she looked up, her eyes clouded with something I'd never seen in her before. Regret, maybe? Or guilt?
Being young is sometimes a curse, dear. I was married to Liam's father long before you ever came along. It was a time of war, with the vampires. We had sworn enemies, and I caught the eye of someone I shouldn't have.
I could feel the tension in her words, the way they seemed to weigh down the air between us. I sat down slowly, bracing myself, but I couldn't have anticipated what she would reveal next.
"The king of the vampires, Rick," she whispered.
Her voice almost reverent, like she was speaking of someone she'd lost.
"He was deadly gorgeous, all-consuming in a way I'd never experienced before. Despite our differences, despite the war, I fell for him."
Her words hung in the air and my mind reeled. Liam's mother, the woman who'd raised him with a strict sense of loyalty to his pack, had once been entangled with a vampire king. And not just entangled, she had fallen in love with him.
One night, Liam's father was out with the pack members, and Rick slipped in without a sound, just like he always did.
Her lips curved into a small, wistful smile.
He pulled me close, his hands tracing every curve, and our lips met. We gave in. It was as if nothing else mattered in that moment.
She paused, glancing away as if she was lost in the memory. I wanted to scream, to shake her out of it. She was telling me this story like it was some tragic romance. But to me, it felt like the betrayal of a lifetime.
And then I got pregnant with Liam. He's a hybrid, Alice. Half werewolf, half vampire. And that's why he craves blood. I couldn't hold back the anger anymore.
I couldn't hold back the anger anymore. "And you didn't think I should know this before I married him?" My voice was louder than I'd intended, echoing around the room. She straightened, her expression hardening.
You think it was easy for me? Do you think I wanted him to grow up this way? To bear the curse of two worlds? I kept it a secret, not just for my sake, but for Liam's. Even his father doesn't know. I did what I had to, Alice, for all of us.
My hands balled into fists, the weight of her words crashing down on me. A secret like this, hidden from the very beginning. And now I was caught up in it, a part of a twisted legacy I hadn't asked for.
Stay quiet,
she said, her tone almost pleading.
For everyone's sake.
I looked into her eyes, feeling the betrayal sting deeper than I could have imagined, but something else stopped me from lashing out. There was a part of her, a small, vulnerable part, that seemed genuinely afraid, like she was begging for my silence not out of pride, but out of fear for what the truth might destroy. I nodded, barely, just enough to let her think I understood. But as I turned away, the anger still burned in my chest, relentless and unyielding. When I finally left the house, I headed straight for the woods, my heart pounding with the weight of what I'd just learned, and then I saw him, Andrian, standing in the shade of an ancient oak, his silhouette somehow comforting and terrifying all at once. Without a second thought, I walked up to him, my breaths coming fast, words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Andrian, there's something I need to tell you." He watched me, his gaze steady, his presence grounding me in a way I couldn't explain.
Go on.
He said softly, a trace of worry in his voice. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Liam, he's not just a werewolf, he's part vampire too. His mother, she had an affair with the vampire king." My voice trembled as I spoke, the words heavy with disbelief. "And that's why he craves blood." Andrian's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Anger, maybe, or hurt. I couldn't tell. Tears slipped down my cheeks, each one marking the quiet ache I couldn't put into words. For a heartbeat, I thought he might pull me closer. Instead, he just reached out, thumb brushing softly across my cheek as he wiped the tears away, momentarily easing the ache inside.
We will find out a way together.
I felt the roughness of his finger brush against my lips, a touch that ignited a mix of longing and desperation. But then he froze, and the world around us felt suspended in that moment. I sensed the hesitation building within him, the weight of unspoken words and emotions hanging in the air. His hand lingered there for what felt like an eternity, and I could almost see the struggle in his eyes as he fought to control whatever was rising within him. Then he shifted nervously and slipped his hands into his pockets. He looked up at me, his gaze lingering.
There's a masquerade party at a club nearby tomorrow,
He said, his voice almost hesitant.
I thought maybe we should go. A lot of people gather there. You could use a break, and who knows? Could be worth checking out. Maybe we'll find something.
I hesitated, weighing the risk of walking into a crowded club with him. But there was a strange pull in Adrian's voice, a quiet hope that maybe he'd found a way to help. "All right," I finally agreed, my voice steady even as my pulse raced. "We'll go. But you'd better have a good mask. If this goes wrong—"
It won't.
He interrupted, a quick, confident smile spreading across his face hesitantly.
Trust me.
His assurance caught me off guard. "We'll see," I replied, a hint of a challenge slipping into my tone. And with that, I turned, heading back toward the fortress to prepare for what I knew would be a night filled with more questions than answers. That afternoon, my mother-in-law appeared in my room, her eyes softened with worry.
"Alice, my child, you need to take care of yourself,"
she murmured, her hand gentle on my shoulder. We exchanged a quiet moment, her understanding reaching me in a way that almost broke through the barriers I'd put up. I promised her I'd rest, and that day, for the first time in what felt like ages, I allowed myself to sleep, letting the weariness finally catch up to me. When I woke up, the night had already fell. I woke and dressed, choosing a dark, off-shoulder gown that had hung untouched in my wardrobe for months. I wasn't sure if I was dressing up for myself or for the possibility of being seen, but as I caught my reflection, a glimmer of confidence surfaced, one I hadn't felt in a long time. I knew I was late, so I rushed through the trees to reach to Andrian as fast as I could. I found him leaning against his bike, his familiar black jacket and jeans catching the faint moonlight. "Adrian," I said breathlessly, still catching my breath as I approached. He turned, and his eyes met mine. His gaze traced my figure with a look of quiet appreciation, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between us.
You're late.
He teased, though his voice held a softness, an edge of admiration. I chuckled, trying to keep the mood light. "Don't you ever change your clothes?" He smirked, his usual half-smile returning as he climbed onto the bike.
These work just fine.
he said, handing me the helmet. As we drove through the busy roads, the city lights flickering past us, I couldn't help but ask, "Why do you help me, Adrian?" My voice was barely more than a whisper, almost lost to the hum of the engine and the bustle around us.
Because you're worth helping, Alice.
He said, looking back over his shoulder. His gaze softened just a bit, that guarded expression he always wore slipping for a moment. The club was alive with energy, the pulse of music syncing with the beat of every heartbeat in the crowded room. Lights flashed and shifted, casting shadows that moved and flickered across faces and masks. As we moved through the crowd, Adrian's hand rested lightly at the small of my back, guiding me, steadying me. I noticed the way his gaze would flit to me every so often, a mixture of worry and something else I wasn't ready to name. Adrian and I had been searching for any sign of Liam for what felt like hours, my eyes scanning the sea of bodies moving rhythmically around us. We sat at a small table off to the side, drinks in hand, our voices low under the thumping bass. I leaned back, taking a sip, feeling the comforting burn of the drink settle in my chest. For a moment, it felt almost normal, as though we were just two people out for the night, the burdens of the past few months forgotten. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of someone familiar. A man stood near the center of the dance floor, his body pressed close to a woman as they moved together, his hands tracing her figure with an intimacy that made my stomach turn. There was no mistaking it. That was Liam. My Liam, or at least the Liam I'd been desperate to find. But he wasn't lost or in trouble. He was here, holding another woman like she was his whole world. "Adrian," I breathed, my hand instinctively reaching out to him, my fingers clutching his arm. He followed my gaze, his eyes narrowing as they settled on the scene before us. He tensed beside me, clearly shocked but staying calm, his face set in determination. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and before I could stop myself, I downed the rest of my drink, the taste bitter on my tongue. The hurt cut deep, and jealousy pooled in my chest, burning hot. I reached for another glass and another, until my vision started to blur and the weight of my emotions felt heavier, pressing down like a storm. "I have to ask him," I muttered, barely registering the strength in my own voice. "I need to know why he's doing this." Adrian's hand caught my wrist before I could rise from my seat, his touch gentle but firm.
Alice, think about this.
He said quietly, his eyes locking onto mine.
We need to understand what's really happening here. He shouldn't know that we found him.
Feeling the frustration boiling in me as I struggled between the logic of his words and the raw pain tearing through me. But he didn't let go, his hand holding mine in place, grounding me. Reluctantly, I sank back into my seat, though my eyes stayed fixed on Liam and the woman who seemed all too happy to be in his arms. I could feel the tears welling up, a sting I tried desperately to ignore. But the drinks didn't help, and every look, every touch Liam shared with her was like another jab to my heart. My hands shook, and with each sip, the pain only grew sharper. Finally, as the night dragged on, my thoughts became hazy, the club lights a blur, and my legs felt like lead when I tried to stand. I stumbled, feeling my balance slip, and before I knew it, Adrian was by my side, steadying me.
Come on, Alice.
His arm wrapping around my shoulders as he led me out of the club.
Let's get you somewhere safe.
The cool night air hit my face as he lifted me, his strong arms carrying me effortlessly. The world felt distant, the edges blurred, but Adrian's presence was steady, comforting in a way I hadn't expected. My head rested against his shoulder, and I felt myself losing the battle to stay composed. "Why, Adrian?" My voice cracked, and I barely recognized the brokenness in it. "Why would he do this?" He didn't answer, just held me close as he walked us through the dark streets toward his place. His silence was somehow better than any words, grounding me in the present as I let myself be carried away from the hurt if only for a moment. When we reached his home, he opened the door carefully. The room was dark, warm, and smelled faintly of cedar and spice like him. He carried me to his bed and gently laid me down, tucking a blanket over me as I fought to keep my eyes open. I glanced up at him, catching his gaze as he hovered nearby, watching over me with a quiet concern. "It aches, Adrian," I whispered, pressing a hand to my chest. The hurt was physical, a weight that made it hard to breathe.
Where?
He asked softly, his brow furrowing. With a slight tremble, I took his hand and placed it over my heart. "Here." He looked at me, and in that moment, the wall I usually kept so carefully constructed around myself seemed to crack, just a little. His hand stayed there, resting on my chest, and I could feel the warmth of his palm even through the fabric. His face was filled with a hesitation and longing.
Hey.
He whispered, his voice soothing, his thumb grazing over my collarbone in the softest, most comforting touch.
It'll be okay, Alice. I'm here.
The tears spilled over, blurring my vision as I looked up at him. He reached up, gently brushing them away, his fingertips warm and steady.
You don't have to do this alone, okay? I will always stay by your side.
He said quietly, his voice rough but so gentle. I closed my eyes, feeling the exhaustion settle over me, his presence calming the storm inside. He stayed there, holding my hand and brushing my hair until sleep finally took me. The morning light slipped through the curtains, soft and warm, nudging me awake. My eyes opened to a solid warmth beneath me, a chest, rising and falling softly in rhythm. I blinked, and suddenly I was wide awake, realizing my head was resting on Adrian's chest, my legs casually tangled with his. Startled, I jolted upright, causing him to stir slightly but not wake. He just turned, settling back into sleep, looking as peaceful as a stone on the beach. My heart was racing, and a flood of questions spun through my mind. Did we? I peeked under the blanket, just to check, and sighed in relief. I was still dressed in the same clothes from last night, and so was he. I sat back, feeling my cheeks warm as I stole a glance at him, lying there with that look of innocence that only sleep could bring. Last night, I'd been a mess, tangled up in jealousy and grief. He'd taken care of me, even carried me to bed. But he hadn't crossed a line, hadn't taken advantage of my fragile state. A tender feeling rose up, a quiet gratitude for his restraint, for the way he held me together when I could have easily fallen apart. I looked at him, at his face softened in sleep, and felt a strange pull, one I'd kept at a distance until now. My eyes wandered down to the familiar chain resting against his chest. Adrian always wore that pendant, but I'd never gotten a closer look at it. Something about the pendant always felt private, something he kept close to him like a secret. Gently, as not to wake him, I picked it up and studied it. It was heart-shaped and old, the kind of craftsmanship you didn't see these days. And it had a clasp. My curiosity got the better of me, and I unlatched it, opening the pendant. Inside were two small, weathered photographs. The first one on the left took me by surprise. It was Adrian, dressed in attire that looked straight out of the Victorian era. He wore a tight-fitting calf-length coat with a double-breasted waist. His hair was styled back in a way that looked strangely familiar, like he'd walked right out of a history book. A quiet smile tugged at my lips. Maybe it was for a costume party or something, I thought. My gaze drifted to the right side of the pendant, and my heart nearly stopped. It was me. My own face stared back at me, framed in a fashion I had never seen before, a gown with a plunging neckline, collapsed sleeves, and an elegant, full skirt. My hair was arranged with a set of old-fashioned pins, and delicate jewelry hung around my neck. I looked regal, like someone from a forgotten time. But I couldn't remember ever wearing anything like that. I didn't own anything like that. My head spun as I tried to remember if I'd ever been to any sort of costume party, but nothing came to mind. I closed the pendant, feeling a strange sense of vertigo as the implications sank in. I'd never worn an outfit like that, not in my entire life. And yet, the image in that locket, it was me. No doubt about it. My head spun with questions, each one more confusing than the last. How? Why? Alice, came Adrian's groggy voice, soft with sleep. He shifted, slowly waking up, his eyes blinking open. He looked at me with a warmth that seemed to linger between us from last night.
Alice, you're awake.
I managed to smile, my hands quickly hiding the pendant. Yeah. Morning. My heart raced, but I fought to keep my face neutral, hoping he hadn't noticed anything. Adrian stretched beside me, looking far too relaxed for someone who'd let me crash in his bed, fully dressed, after a night like that.
How are you feeling?
Better, I said, giving a small nod. I didn't want to jump into a flood of questions, but curiosity gnawed at me. And thanks for not, you know. A faint flush colored his cheeks, and he laughed, looking almost shy.
Alice, you were a mess last night. The last thing you needed was for me to complicate that.
I couldn't help but smile. He really was something else. But then, as he propped himself up on his elbows, his gaze fell on the pendant around his neck. For a brief moment, his face flickered with something unreadable. I knew I should say something, ask about the photo I'd just seen, but I hesitated. The pendant had clearly meant something deep to him, and he hadn't shared that with me. At least, not yet.
Want some coffee?
Adrian's voice pulled me out of my thoughts, warm and familiar. I looked at him, still trying to shake off the confusion in my head, and nodded. Yes, please, I replied, trying to sound casual. He got up, heading to the kitchen, leaving me in that quiet space to think. My mind kept replaying the moment I'd seen the pendant, the photo of him in clothes from an era I didn't even think he'd care about, and then that picture of me. It had to mean something, but what? My eyes drifted over to him, watching him pour coffee as if it were any other day. Moments later, Adrian returned, a steaming mug in each hand. He settled back onto the bed beside me, passing one over. The rich aroma of coffee filled the air, warming me, easing the tension a little. We sat there in silence, sipping from our mugs. I wanted to stay in this peaceful moment, but the questions burning inside me wouldn't let me rest. I glanced at him, at the chains still around his neck. Adrian, I started, trying to sound casual. That chain you wear, it's so old. Why do you still keep it on? The color's all faded. He glanced down at it, his voice low.
You're right about that. It's been with me for a long time.
He paused, as if weighing his words, then added,
A special person gave this to me.
The response struck a nerve. I tried to keep my tone light, but there was no hiding the curiosity, and maybe a little jealousy in my voice. A girlfriend? He chuckled softly.
Yeah, you could say that.
I nodded, forcing a small smile. What happened to her? Where is she now? He glanced at his coffee, swirling it around in his mug before he answered, his voice quieter, almost nostalgic.
She's married to someone else now.
A strange sadness washed over me at his words. I didn't know why. Maybe it was the thought of him loving someone so deeply, enough to carry her memory with him for so long. But there was something else, a feeling that I couldn't shake, as if there was something important I was missing. I needed to know more, needed to understand why the pendant held a photo of me in a dress I'd never worn in my life. Could I see her picture? I asked, trying to keep my voice light, almost playful. But the question felt heavy, loaded with so much I couldn't put into words. Adrian looked at me, his face heavy with a sadness.
Yes, I'll show you her picture and tell you all the messed up stories we've been through together. But for now, Alice should head home. It's getting late.
Yeah, you're right, I said. He rose, gathering his things to walk me out. As he opened the door, a quiet sigh escaped me. We stepped outside, the lightness of morning feeling almost too bright after the strange, heavy night. We walked side by side to the edge of the fortress grounds. When we reached the corner where he'd have to turn back, he paused, his eyes meeting mine. For a second, he looked as though he might say something, as if there were words right on the edge of his tongue. But he didn't. He just gave me a quiet nod, his hand lingering for a second longer than it needed to as he brushed against my arm. And as I turned to walk away, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to his gaze, something like a longing, or maybe a quiet wish that he didn't have to let me go. As soon as I stepped inside the house, there she was, Liam's mother waiting for me in the hallway. Her eyes, stern and questioning, met mine before I even had the chance to take off my shoes.
Who was the man who dropped you off, Alice?
Her voice was tight, edged with accusation.
Do you know what people might think? Seeing you with another man like that? You're Liam's wife, the Luna of this pack.
My heart pounded. I wanted to hold back, to choose my words carefully, but the frustration from last night surged forward. I was at the club last night because Liam was there. With another woman, I said, my voice catching a little. I watched him dance with her, saw him look at her like he... I stopped, fighting down the hurt.
He was at the club?
Disbelief lacing her words.
We'll send our soldiers to track down Liam again.
Her tone firm, almost unyielding. Her eyes softened just a little, but the judgment didn't leave.
But remember this, you're not seeing this man again.
I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. I understand, I murmured, my voice quiet. I won't see him again. But my heart felt heavy as I said it. That night, my mind refused to rest. Thoughts of Andrian kept drifting back to me, his quiet strength, the way he listened without judgment, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at me. I thought about Liam, about the secrets he was hiding, and the weight of it all left me restless. I lay there thinking of Andrian, wondering about Liam, until sleep finally overtook me. When morning came, I glanced out the window, and there he was, Andrian leaning against a tree near the edge of the woods, looking exhausted, as if he'd spent the night there. Without thinking, I rushed outside, my heart pounding with surprise and relief. Andrian, I called, catching his attention as I reached him. He straightened, his face breaking into a smile, one that made my heart flutter despite everything weighing it down.
I've been waiting for you,
he murmured, his voice filled with a longing that mirrored my own. I tried to explain the confrontation with Liam's mother, my words tumbling out faster than I intended. She was furious, I began. I tried to explain, the suspicions, the fear, but he gently placed a finger against my lips, silencing me.
It's all right, I know you've been through a lot, you don't have to explain.
He whispered, his gaze soft.
I looked for Liam last night, Alice.
Andrian began.
Liam is staying in a nearby city. He doesn't seem in a hurry to come back.
I sighed, relief and anger mixing. Then tonight we'll go to him, I said quietly, determination taking over. As I turned to head back to the fortress, his arms slipped around me from behind, pulling me close. His hands pressed firmly over my chest as if to shield me from everything. His breath grazed my neck before he pressed a soft, lingering kiss there, and a shiver ran down my spine.
Promise me that you'll be back,
he whispered. My heart beat faster, and for a moment, nothing else mattered. I turned in his embrace, meeting his gaze, unable to resist the pull between us. I leaned into him, our lips met, softly at first, a careful, tentative closeness. But then, as his hands found their way to my waist, he deepens the kiss, his touch stealing my breath as his tongue touched mine. With an intensity I could feel down to my core, filling me with a longing I hadn't let myself acknowledge. When we finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine, his voice hoarse with emotion.
I know I shouldn't feel this way,
he whispered.
Alice, I can't help it. Forgive me if I'm out of place.
I smiled softly, reaching up to touch his cheek, letting him see everything I felt. There's nothing to forgive, Adrian, I said, my voice as steady as I could make it. I'll see you tomorrow. As I walked toward the fortress, a quiet thought crept in. Is he mistaking me with someone else? The doubt lingered for a heartbeat, but I pushed it away. Right now, I needed to focus on one thing: Liam's secret. The night had a chill to it as I slipped into the hallway, pulling my cloak tighter around my shoulders. My heart was racing. The anticipation to see Andrian, to finally get answers, overshadowed everything else. I reached for the door handle, barely holding back my eagerness when a voice stopped me cold.
Where are you going, Alice?
I froze, recognizing the tone before I even turned around. There she was, Liam's mother, her arms crossed, her gaze sharp and unwavering. Her presence seemed to fill the hallway, casting a shadow over my intentions. I swallowed, forcing myself to stay calm. Andrian found out where Liam's staying, I explained, choosing my words carefully. I need to go to him, to understand why he's been doing this. But she scoffed, disbelief etched on her face.
And you expect me to believe that? Or is this just another excuse to run off and spend the night in that man's arms?
Her voice dripped with accusation, a mixture of anger and something else. My patience wavered, the months of silent tension between us bubbling to the surface. I have to ask Liam why he's been lying, why he's gone, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. She cut in sharply, stepping closer.
You don't care where Liam is. What you care about is Andrian. I can see what's going on between you two. If you leave this fortress tonight, don't expect to return.
Her words hit like a slap, but I couldn't let them keep me here. She could believe what she wanted, think whatever she needed to think, but I couldn't stay any longer without knowing the truth. There were too many secrets between us, and I couldn't let her threat stop me. I had a right to find answers. I don't have time for your accusations, not tonight, I said, my tone low, fighting to keep the emotion out of my voice. We can discuss this later. I reached for the door, the weight of her glare on me like fire. Her final words stopped me one last time.
If you leave this fortress tonight, don't expect to return.
Without looking back, I pushed open the door, my resolve stronger than her threats.
You've made your choice. Remember that.
The cold air hit me, and I took a deep, steadying breath. I ran through the night, the darkness swallowing me as I made my way toward the edge of the woods, where Andrian would be waiting. I knew Liam had been slipping further into the darkness for months now, but I'd held on to some foolish hope he'd come back. The truth was, I had to see him myself. One last time. As soon as I reached Adrian, I barely paused to catch my breath. Let's go, I said, urgency lacing my voice. Andrian didn't say anything, just handed me a helmet and climbed onto the bike. The ride was a blur. Trees, flashes of houses, and finally a long stretch of abandoned road. The closer we got, the more tense Andrian grew, his shoulders tight and alert. As we neared the rundown house, Andrian's grip on the handlebars tightened.
Alice, wait. There's something off. I can sense it. A threat.
He glanced back at me, his face shadowed with concern. I stiffened, my heart pounding, but I couldn't afford to hesitate. Not now. Look, if you're not up for this, I understand, I said, more forcefully than I meant to. But I'm not backing down. If you're not coming, I'll go alone. His jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought he might actually leave. But then he reached out, his hand finding mine and giving it a steady squeeze.
You're not going anywhere alone, okay? We will go together.
He murmured. We walked through the overgrown yard, moving carefully as leaves crunched beneath our feet. Andrian held my hand, his grip reassuring yet firm. It was like he was ready to pull me back at any second. Adrian suddenly froze, his grip on my hand tightening as he glanced around, his expression sharpening. What's wrong? I asked, worry creeping into my voice. He turned to me, gently cupping my face, his gaze intent.
Alice, I can sense vampires here, maybe a lot of them. Vampires and werewolves are natural enemies. This place, We shouldn't be here. It is not safe for you.
He murmured, his voice low, almost a growl. A chill ran down my spine as I took in his words. Only werewolves had that kind of instinct. My eyes narrowed as I looked at him, heart pounding. But Adrian, only werewolves can sense vampires. And you're human, right? He hesitated, hands slipping into his pockets, avoiding my gaze.
I'm not human, Alice.
He said, his voice strained. I stared at him, 1,000 questions rushing to my lips. Then, what are you? I managed, the shock clear in my voice. Adrian glanced around, his expression shifting back to guarded urgency.
We'll talk about it later. Right now, we need to stay focused on Liam and the threat coming our way.
I swallowed, nodding, but couldn't shake the feeling that everything I thought I knew had just shifted. As we reached the door, it creaked open before we could knock. A woman appeared, barely dressed, with a glossy, unfocused look in her eyes and a crooked, knowing smile. She leaned in close, her hand reaching up to trace along Adrian's cheek, her gaze steady.
Oh, looking for Liam?
She drawled. I felt Adrian tense beside me as he jerked her hand away, gripping mine tightly. The woman rolled her eyes, a lazy smile still playing on her lips as she stumbled back, waving us inside with a dismissive gesture.
Come on in.
She slurred.
He's around here somewhere.
Adrian shot me a look that was equal parts irritation and reassurance, and we stepped inside, the air thick with a strange tension. The room was dim, shadows twisting across cracked walls. The scent of stale wine and something heavier hung in the air. I followed the woman's lazy wave toward the far side of the room, my heart sinking as I caught sight of him. Liam was there, sprawled across a worn sofa, barely dressed, surrounded by women in various states of undress. He looked so different. Gone was the man I had once known. In his place was someone almost unrecognizable, lost in a haze of self-indulgence. I could feel my heart breaking as he barely glanced my way, his lips twisting into a sly, almost cruel smile.
Well, look who decided to join the party.
He drawled, his voice laced with a mockery I didn't recognize.
Come, sweetheart.
He said, spreading his arms wide.
Join us.
Every inch of me screamed, wanting to pull away, but I took a steadying breath, clenching my hands into fists. Liam, I said, my voice trembling. What are you doing? Why did you disappear like that? Liam's face twisted, his eyes darkening as he rose from the couch, grabbing my arms with a force that sent a warning shiver down my spine.
Why?
He sneered, his voice laced with contempt.
Because I don't want the life of a werewolf. Staying chained to the same partner forever, leading some miserable pack. It's pathetic. They're pathetic.
He said, his gaze boring into me.
And so are you, my lovely wife.
Why did you marry me then? I managed to ask. His grip tightened, almost bruising, his words dripping with disdain. I felt my heart lurch, and before I knew it, my eyes squeezed shut.
I don't like you, okay?
His voice was rough, each word digging into me.
I just did what my mom wanted.
Through the haze of hurt and confusion, I caught a glimpse of Adrian. He was standing rigid, muscles tense, his jaw clenched so hard I thought it might break. His fists had balled at his sides, and his eyes burned with something fierce, an urge I knew all too well, to protect me.
Be gentle with her.
Adrian's voice rang out sharp and commanding, but Liam didn't even flinch, his grip only tightening. In a flash, Adrian crossed the room, pushing Liam back with a force that left the room humming with tension. He stepped between us, shoulders squared as he faced Liam, his voice low and seething.
I told you, be gentle with her, boy.
Oh, so now I am supposed to learn how to treat my wife from a human?
Liam spat, his laugh sharp and cruel as he threw a mocking glance at Adrian. The other women joined in, their laughter almost taunting, as if feeding off the vulnerability Adrian was trying so hard to conceal. Adrian stepped forward, his voice sharp and commanding.
Back off, or I'll end every one of you.
Liam looked him up and down with a mocking sneer.
What's this? A human trying to play hero?
He chuckled, shaking his head.
You really think you stand a chance?
Adrian's face hardened, his eyes flashing in a way I'd never seen before.
I'm not human.
He growled, his voice taking on an edge that made even the vampires hesitate.
I am the Lichen King, deadliest of you all.
My eyes widened. What? He is a Lichen King? I swallowed, trying to steady myself, but my hands shook. The man I married is a hybrid, and the man who always cared for me is a Lichen King. Nothing in my life felt normal now. Adrian, the one I'd shared 100 quiet moments with, the one whose glances always seemed to be hesitant and shy, was a king? My heart pounded, thoughts spiraling as I tried to make sense of it all. Everything he'd done for me, every guarded smile and unspoken word, now felt heavy with a meaning I hadn't been able to see. Before I could respond, one of the women in the room turned toward me, her eyes gleaming with a hungry look.
A werewolf, huh?
She murmured, her voice dripping with malice.
Must be tasty.
In an instant, the atmosphere shifted. The people around us began to change, their eyes darkening, teeth sharpening. Vampires, every last one of them. A cold chill ran through me, but I couldn't look away, frozen in shock as they advanced. In a heartbeat, Andrian began to shift, his body contorting, his clothes tearing as he transformed. His form expanded, muscles rippling beneath thick, dark fur, his eyes gleaming with an intense predatory light. The room filled with the scent of power and rage, and for the first time, I saw him for who he truly was. Chaos erupted. Adrian lunged himself at them. A whirlwind of power and fury, his claws tearing through his enemies with precision. I fought to stay conscious, my own strength fading fast, but I could still see him moving, a force of nature, unstoppable. But then, before I could react, a cold hand wrapped around my neck, pulling me back. I struggled, gasping as a vampiress sank her teeth into my shoulder. Pain blossomed, and my vision blurred, fading into darkness. As the world dimmed, I caught a final glimpse of Andrian, fighting with everything he had, his face filled with a fierce, desperate protectiveness. I realized something that stunned me. Andrian's eyes, so full of intensity, were fixed solely on me. Not just in battle, but with a depth of longing. A depth that told me he would tear the world apart to save me. After some time, my eyes fluttered open, vision blurry and unfocused. The scene around me was a blur. Everyone was lying motionless on the floor, as if time had frozen. And then, through the haze, I saw Adrian, his powerful wolf form, towering over me. His massive jaws closed around me, gentle and protective, lifting me effortlessly from the ground. I surrendered to his touch, letting myself be carried, feeling the soft rhythm of his steps as he moved through the dense, shadowed woods. The cool night air brushed over me, and despite everything, I felt a strange sense of safety, cocooned in his quiet strength. When I opened my eyes, the soft light filtering through the curtains felt like a warm embrace. My body was still heavy with fatigue, but I couldn't shake the memories of the night before. My heart raced as I realized where I was. I turned slowly, holding my breath, and found myself curled up behind Andrian, who lay wounded and completely bare. He was sleeping in a fetal position, his knees tucked up almost to his stomach. His chest rose and fell with each slow breath, a testament to his survival. But the sight of his injuries made my heart clench. I quickly grabbed the blanket draped over the armchair and tucked it around him, careful not to disturb his slumber. There was a subtle strength in his vulnerability that made my heart ache. I couldn't let him suffer. I needed to find something to help him. I stood up, my legs a little shaky, and scanned the dimly lit room for medicine. The house had an old-world charm, rich wood beams overhead, walls lined with books, and a faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. I shuffled to a small cabinet and rifled through its contents. Finally, I found a bottle of medical cream and a wet cloth. Returning to his side, I took a deep breath, my fingers trembling slightly as I soaked the cloth. I gently wiped away the blood and dirt from his wounds, careful not to cause him any more pain. As I applied the cream, his eyelids fluttered, and he slowly opened his eyes, revealing a shade of blue that sent butterflies dancing in my stomach.
Alice,
He murmured, his voice low and raspy.
are you okay?
I paused, feeling the weight of his gaze on me. I'm fine, I reassured him, trying to sound more confident than I felt. You need to rest. He shifted slightly, wincing as I touched a particularly bruised spot.
What happened? You shouldn't have to worry about me.
But I do, I insisted, my heart racing. What you did back there, you fought for me, Andrian. The reality of his bravery hit me like a wave. You're hurt. His expression softened, but there was a shadow of concern in his eyes. I carefully cleaned the wounds, the antiseptic stinging slightly as I swabbed each cut. My heart ached for Adrian, seeing him so vulnerable, yet I felt a sense of purpose in taking care of him. Gently, I applied the healing cream, my fingers brushing softly against his skin. I focused on the soothing rhythm of my hands as I tended to him, hoping my presence could bring him some comfort. He didn't say much, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and pain. Want some coffee? I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady despite the emotions swirling within me. He smiled faintly at me and said,
Yes, please.
As I turned and headed to the kitchen, I could feel his gaze following me, warm and steady. Even lying back in bed, he didn't break his stare, his eyes lingering as if he couldn't bear to look away. The afternoon sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm glow across the room, but my heart felt heavy with questions. I sat on the edge of the bed, a fragile thread of hope and fear weaving through my thoughts. I have so many questions, Andrian. Why didn't you tell me you were a lichen king? My voice trembled slightly, the weight of my discoveries pressing down on me. Who is the woman in your locket? Why does she look like me? Andrian's expression shifted to one of shock, his eyes widening in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. He seemed lost for words, a mix of surprise and something deeper flickering behind his gaze. Slowly, he rose from the bed, but I couldn't let him retreat. Stay here and tell me, I insisted, my voice more urgent.
Are you ready to hear, Alice?
He asked, his tone grave, the weight of his words settling heavily in the space between us.
This reality. Will you be able to bear it?
I took a breath, trying to steady my racing heart. The man I married is a hybrid, I replied, my voice growing firmer. The man I've fallen for is a lichen king. I've already seen too much, Andrian. His eyes searched mine, a tempest of longing and vulnerability swirling within them. He sat back down beside me, the warmth of his body a comfort I desperately needed.
The woman in the pendant is you, Alice.
He said softly, the weight of his confession hanging in the air, and I felt my breath catch. But I never wore such a dress in my entire life, I argued, a faint smile playing on my lips despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. It was almost laughable, the absurdity of it all. Andrian reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind my ear, his touch igniting a spark of warmth in the midst of my confusion.
You are the woman, Alice, but in your previous life.
His words sank into my mind like stones, each one sending ripples of disbelief through me. What do you mean? I whispered, my heart racing as I processed his revelation.
In your previous life, you were Kate,
He continued.
my lover. We loved each other deeply, madly in love. We couldn't stay apart even for a moment.
Andrian's eyes held mine, a mix of longing and sorrow swirling in their depths. He seemed to gather himself, ready to unravel the threads of our shared history.
Every night we stayed in each other's arms, loving each other deeply.
He began, his voice smooth and rich like the finest wine.
But there was one night that changed everything.
I leaned closer, the anticipation pulling me in as he continued.
We were out roaming around in the woods, just enjoying the moment near a pond. It was raining heavily, and we were both soaked to the bone.
He smiled at the memory, his eyes clouded with tears.
You looked so beautiful in that moment. Passion swirled between us like a wave, crashing against the shore of our hearts.
A shiver of embarrassment crept up my spine as I imagined the scene he painted so vividly. And then, what happened? I asked.
I couldn't help myself. I pulled you closer, pressing a kiss of urgency in your lips, exploring your curves, losing myself in the warmth of your body.
Andrian's eyes darkened with desire, and I felt a warmth bloom within me, despite the gravity of the tale.
Slowly I undressed your clothes and you didn't resist. Instead you gave in, stripping away my own clothes too. We made love right there in the woods under the downpour, our bodies glistening in the rain.
Heat flooded my cheeks, and I looked down, feeling shy at the intimacy of his words, but his expression remained serious as he continued.
And then, just as we finished, the moon goddess appeared angrily, her presence filling the air with a chilling force. It was a forbidden place for lovers, and she did not take kindly to our transgressions.
My heart sank as I processed his words. What happened next? I asked, almost afraid of the answer.
She cursed us.
His voice low and thick with emotion.
You would lose all your memories and go with another man. And I was cursed to be immortal, forced to stay away from you.
Shock coursed through me, my mind racing to comprehend the enormity of his confession. But why didn't you tell me this sooner? I felt the hurt rise within me, the sting of betrayal mingling with confusion.
Because, Alice,
he replied, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my heart race.
if you had known and then fallen in love with me, the curse would remain unbroken. You would have to fall in love with me in this life, by your own choice, without any memory of our past.
I looked at Andrian, his expression a mix of pain and longing. I love you, Andrian. I breathed, the words spilling from my lips before I could second-guess them. I have already fallen for you. I never thought I would, but the way you cared for me, the way you stayed with me through every problem, it's impossible not to love you. His eyes widened, and in an instant, the air between us changed, humming with a charge that made my skin tingle. He pulled me closer, and the moment felt dreamlike, as if all those years of longing had finally brought us to this one fragile point. His hands moved over me slowly, almost reverently, like he was afraid that if he let himself fully feel this, I might disappear.
Alice,
He murmured, his voice low and rough.
those years without you felt like centuries. Every night was a battle against the emptiness, and now that I have you here,
His voice trailed off, the emotion in his words filling the quiet between us. Before I could respond, he pulled me to him, his lips crashing into mine, fierce with relief and hunger, a silent confession of everything he'd felt in our time apart. I melted into him, returning his intensity, surrendering to the fire that had been quietly building between us for so long. "Wait," I managed to whisper, pulling back just enough to catch my breath. "You're still hurt,"
it doesn't matter.
he said, his eyes dark and brimming with need.
The only thing I need right now is you.
With a gentle but undeniable urgency, he lifted me, almost hesitantly guiding me until I was above him, our bodies fitting together in a way that felt instinctive, almost fated. I placed my hands on his chest, feeling the roughness of his skin under my fingertips, the evidence of all he had endured. Slowly, his hands moved, tracing the curve of my waist, just barely holding on, as if he was still hesitating, not wanting to let go of the control he was used to. I covered his hands with mine, intertwining our fingers as I leaned down, letting our foreheads touch. "I love you so much, Andrian," I whispered softly in his ears. The tension melted as he let out a breath he'd been holding, sinking back against the cushions. His hand moved to cup my face, his thumb brushing over my cheek. He held my gaze as he slowly, deliberately began to undress me, his fingers working with a reverence. I leaned forward, his lips meeting mine in a fierce, almost desperate kiss that spoke of everything he hadn't been able to say. "Andrian," I murmured, moving over him slowly. His hands traced gentle lines along my back, holding me to him, as though every lost moment between us had only strengthened this connection. My hands traced the lines of his jaw as I deepened the rhythm between us, feeling him surrender beneath me. His eyes never leaving mine until we were both exhausted, he pulled me closer, pressing a kiss on my forehead. And I found myself curled against him, my head resting on his chest, lulled by the gentle rhythm of his heartbeat. But as sleep began to pull me under, the room seemed to shift, and I sensed something otherworldly in the air. A soft, silvery glow filled the space, and I opened my eyes to see the moon goddess standing before us, her form shimmering like the stars.
Andrian,
She spoke, her voice soft and melodic.
the curse has been lifted. You are mortal now, free to live and love until the end of your days.
I gasped, her words sinking in like sunlight breaking through a storm. Turning to Andrian, I saw disbelief and joy mix in his expression, his eyes searching mine. Are we really free? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper, trembling with hope. He nodded slowly, a smile spreading across his face, brightening the entire room.
Yes, my love, we're finally free.
In that moment, everything felt new and limitless. The past no longer held its grip on us. Instead, we stood on the edge of a future we could finally call our own, untethered from the chains of what had been. Wrapping my arms around him, I felt the weight of sorrow lift, replaced by a hope so fierce it nearly took my breath away.